Right. So a quick recap of what we have done the other day, that is yesterday. It was block 3, where we spoke about, or we discussed about the 20th century fiction, in which we have studied a modernist novel, then about Mrs. Dalloway, the novel by Virginia Woolf, and The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Right. Now, moving on to another block, that is block 4, we have 20th century American fiction. So today we are going to look into the American fiction of 20th century. Right. Right. Let me just share the screen. Right. So here we go. So basically, let us talk about the modernism in literature, right? Then it was a kind of a movement, isn't it? May it be in a British or may it be American. So modernism, it was a kind of a movement that was, and in literature, which was from 1914 to 1945, that is characterized by a rejection of the traditional forms of writing in favor of bold experimentation in both poetry and prose. And, works of fiction no longer ended in the conventional way, where the hero wins the day, that the world is safe and the audience has closure. Instead, the audience is introduced to a new kind of hero, one that carries with him the disillusionment and fragmentation that characterizes the modernist era. So, here, when you look into the so we're going to study about the literature which is written in English in the United States of America. And this was heavily influenced by the Civil War, which was going on at that point of time. Some of the, and we are also going to look into some of the major writers of that period, right? And then also, there's one more remarkable growth in one of this, that was rise of African American writers, right? So there was a kind of an effect on, the changing events and developments such as the world wars and Great Depression changed fiction. Novels' regular form changed for experimental forms of flux, perplexity, openness, skepticism, freedom, and horror. Chapters broken into fragments, sentences dissolved into the streams and flows of interior psychic life. Freudian psychology and Marxism influenced writers. Doubt, the dominant mode of modern fiction, truth made a relative thing. Modern novels deal in no absolutes, moral, perceptual, or cultural. Traditional narration replaced with subjective narrative. So, modern age, that was 1900 to 1959, somewhere around. So, since the dawn of the 20th century, writers were looking for new ways of writing and new topics. Their writings express their feelings. about living in the modern age. Some of them wrote positively, some negatively. Their style became more complicated. Experiments were quite common. Many movements appeared. Together, they might be called modernism. Right. So, if you look into the characteristics of this, one can find an offshoot of realism, naturalism, which claim to give an even more realistic and unflinching depiction of contemporary life. Naturalism was characterized by a pessimistic view of humanity and human existence. Now, this was a period in British and American literature, which was spanning the years between World War I and World War II. Works in this period reflect the changing social, political, and cultural climate and are diverse, experimental, and non traditional. And the Harlem Renaissance was the first major, uh, happening of visual, literary, and performing arts by African Americans concerned with African American life, art, culture, and politics. The influence of the Harlem Renaissance remained strong for the remainder of the 20th century. So there's something called the lost generation. This was, the first movement of the early 20th century, which involves a group called the lost generation. The term invented by Gertrude Stein, he was the man who actually coined it to refer to a group of writers who felt alienated to the world. They wrote about young people who do not find any pleasure in everyday life or becoming rich. The group included Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, John Dos Passos, and William Faulkner. Ernest Hemingway is probably the most famous representative. His writing style is very plain. However, his stories and novels are sometimes compared to an iceberg. That means you can see only its, just a part of it, only the tip of it, and the rest is hidden below the surface. So his novelette, The Old Man and the Sea, earned him the Nobel Prize for Literature. It shows the struggle between a fisherman called Santiago and the natural world. Now, another important aspect is African American literature became more prominent as the struggle for human rights intensified. They followed the so called Harlem Renaissance, a movement of Black writers from the 1920s. So, James Baldwin was an essayist and novelist writing not only about Black people's problems, but also about homosexuals' problems. Now, coming to the World War I, the war ended in 1918. That was a kind of a brutal carnage because the kind of the warfare was almost like, trench warfare, chemical weapons. It was quite, I mean, very difficult for the people to survive after this world war. Then we have another group, as I already discussed, about the lost generation, a group of people which, they found no purpose in life. And two main characters, Nick and Gatsby, fought in World War One. Then new technologies were developed to make war goods. Industry boomed, thus the economy boomed. Well, let us quickly have a look at the important writers of this period. So, in the history of American literature, there are galaxy of writers emerged during 1900 to 1950. And here, writers of worth reading include African American, and that has been discussed here, keeping in mind the focus on the issues of Melus. The novelists of this are famous for portraying the realism, gender issues, and women empowerment, and so on. Now, let me just name a few. William Faulkner is one writer who has got an important aspect of discussion where His great rival as a stylist and myth maker was William Faulkner. Hemingway's great rival was William Faulkner, whose writing was as barrack as Hemingway's was spare. Now, here he combined stream of consciousness techniques with rich social history. Now, works such as The Sound and the Fury, As I Lay Dying, Light in August, and The Hamlet were parts of the unfolding history of Yoknapatawa County, a mythical Mississippi community. Next, coming to Ernest Hemingway. Now, his short stories and his first novels, The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, were full of existential disillusionment of the lost generation expatriates. Then we have Sherwood Anderson. The novels of Anderson are Windy, Macpherson's Son, Marching Men, Poor White, Many Marriages, Dark Laughter. Then we have F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, let me remind you once again that we have this prescribed in our topic, in our unit today. That is F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. So, we're going to do it. So, he is also one of the prominent writers, right? So, this he had written This Paradise, The Beautiful and Damned Side, The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Tender is the Night, The Love of the Last Tycoon. These novels show the American history, illusion and reality, wealth, youth, maturity, beauty, and economic classes are some prominent themes. Then we have Sinclair Lewis. He was one of the famous novelists of America. His notable novels are Main Street, Babbitt, Arrowsmith, and Who Knew Coolidge, and From Main Street to Stockholm, Letters of Sinclair Lewis. Then we have John Steinbeck. Then we have Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Susan Glaspell, and Nella Larson, right? So these are some of the prominent writers of this period. So modernism and experimentation, emphasis on style and how a story is told. So experimentation with structure and point of view in both poetry and prose. Now, sub-movements within modernism and experimentation include the Harlem Renaissance and the Lost Generation. Now, basically, what is this Harlem Renaissance? Which was, it was kind of a focus on the African American experience, experimentation with style and structure. Now, the examples include the poetry of Langston Hughes. He was an African, basically, African American. And Langston Hughes, and Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, right? Then let me just reiterate about the Lost Generation. They were like, rebellion against established American cultural ideals and themes of disillusionment and critics of the American dream, for which the examples are The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway and The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, modern American prose novels and essays that were published after World War II. Now, here, authors employed a wide variety of themes and styles to describe the experience of the contemporary world, usually following the themes and arguments seen in postmodernism. Now, the decade of 1920, which is also known as the Jazz Age or New Negro Movement, Jazz music swept up from New Orleans to capture the national imagination. Improvised and wild jazz broke the rules of music and provided a soundtrack to the 1920s. So, this is what I was talking about, the Harlem Renaissance, which was a cultural and artistic movement that celebrated African American culture and identity. The key figures include Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay, a major writers of Harlem Renaissance. There were Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Jean Toomer, Nella Larson. Right. American fiction of post-World War. Now, World War II gave a new direction to literary development in the United States. Anything not connected with the war must be postponed, was the chief unwritten law of the wartime era. Moreover, the war drastically reduced the productivity of all writers. Now, Faulkner remarked, "You don't write well in war." Many writers were in the front as war correspondents, like E. Hemingway, or in the active army, like J. Cheever, S. Below, N. Mailer, Vanguard, and they naturally had no time for artistic creativity because they were in the war front. They were actively participating in, they did take part in the war. So they didn't have much time to write. Then coming to African American writers, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, and African American women published some of the most important post World War II American fiction. Now, such as In the Bluest Eye, Sula, Song of Solomon, Beloved, Jazz, and Paradise. Now, Toni Morrison created a strikingly original fiction that sounded different notes from lyrical recollection to magic realism. Right. Quickly look into a brief biography of Toni Morrison. Born February 18, 1931 in Lorraine, Ohio. Grandfather was born a slave. Her family lost their land and were forced to work in the mines and mills of the industrialized North. She was a novelist and an essayist who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. Her works often deal with themes of race, identity, and the African American experience. So she has won the Pulitzer Prize for her novel Beloved and the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first African American woman to win the award. Right. So let me just talk about this lost generation writers. World War One, originally called the Great War, resulted in more than 9 million deaths. The official starting point was the assassination of the heir to the Austro Hungarian throne. However, this was simply the spark that lit a tinder cake of overbuilt armies, imperial tensions, and complex alliances, creating two opposing political forces in Europe, the Allies and the Central Powers. Now, here, uh, the Great War became a war of attrition due to the use of trench warfare, in which both sides dug elaborate trenches where they could shelter from the enemy's artillery fire. The trench would be protected by barbed wire. In between the trenches stretched no man's land, and troops ordered over the top would have to climb up and cross a considerable space unprotected from the enemy firearms in order to reach their foes and attack. Such a charge usually would gain aside only a small stretch of land, if any, and would result in many deaths. Chemical attacks had not yet been banned. So, Wilfred Owen's poem, Dulcet Decorum, describes the experience of facing a gas attack. While living in the trenches, conditions were deplorable. Disease was rife. Trench foot, in which soldiers suffered from gangrene and fungus as a result of wet, muddy conditions. Trench fever, which included conjunctivitis, rashes, and headaches, and trench mouth, ulcerative gingivitis. At least 2 million deaths in the trenches resulted from disease before the Treaty of Versailles ended the war on 28 June. So, in the aftermath of the war, there arose a group of young people known as the Lost Generation. So, the term was coined by, as I already told you, Gertrude Stein. He witnessed the owner of a garage saying to his young employee, which Hemingway later used as an epigraph to his novel, The Sun Also Rises. So, this accusation referred to the lack of purpose or drive resulting from the horrific disillusionment felt by those who grew up and lived through the war and were then in their 20s and 30s. So, basically, what were the common themes in works of literature during that period of time? It was decadence, gender roles and impotence, then idealized past, African American literature, right? And so these were some of the themes which were reflecting in their writings. Right. So when you talk about the F. Scott Fitzgerald, Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald, born in 1896 in Minnesota, Princeton class of 1917, and on academic probation and later dropped out, enrolled in army near end of World War I, became a second lieutenant and was discharged in 1919. So Francis Scott Fitzgerald, the Great Gatsby. So let me just give you a brief intro about Fitzgerald. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was born in September 24, 1896 in St. Paul, Minnesota. He His love for literature was visible right from his young age. He got his first work published at the age of 13. It was a detective story in the school newspaper. He was encouraged to pursue writing by his teacher at Newman School, who recognized the literary talent in him. Also, at Newman, he demonstrated his interest in football. So after Newman, he enrolled as Princeton University, where he happened to meet Edmund Wilson and John Peele Bishop. They became friends. Also at Princeton, he met Geneva King, with whom he had an affair for some years. So it was during the service in the army, he met Zelda Sayre and fell in love. Later, he started working in the advertising industry and kept his dream for literature alive by writing numerous short stories and satires. He was financially struggling. As a result, his engagement with Zelda could not materialize. He returned home and began working in this on the side of paradise. It was based on his life at Princeton University. Now, this novel got published in 1920 and became immensely popular with more than 40,000 copies sold in the first year itself. His financial conditions improved and the engagement was resumed. And they both got married on 3rd April. They had a baby girl a year later. He was working on his second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, which got published in 1922. Then, in the same year, his third work, Tales of the Jazz Age, was published. This work was a collection of 11 short stories. Right. Now, at the age of 44, he died of heart attack and he could not complete his last work. It was Edmund Wilson who completed it and published it under the title The Last Tycoon in 1941. The Great Gatsby remains his most important contribution in the literary field, influencing scholars such as T.S. Eliot and J.D. Salinger. He, in fact, wanted to be a writer but had a playboy reputation. He was not taken seriously by critics. He wrote sober, although an alcoholic. Even though he earned money from novels and screenplays, he was still very unhappy. So, this is the novel which is written by Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. Now, this is written in 1924, addresses different classes of society, money, and scandal during the roaring 20s. Fitzgerald wrote many of these details from his early life in Gatsby. So, this is something which was set in fictional towns of West Egg and East Egg. The story of the Great Gatsby is about Jay Gatsby, a young millionaire. He makes an attempt to reunite with his former lover, Daisy Buchanan. Now, this story provides an account the 1920s America marked by its hedonistic culture. The Great Gatsby is partly biographical. The protagonist, Gatsby and Fitzgerald, share similar passion about love and party. Now, Daisy of Gatsby bears resemblance to Ginevra, King of Fitzgerald. Right. So it's set on an island, East Egg and West Egg, where East Egg symbolizes, it's a symbolic term for old money, and a West Egg, which means new money. Old money here, it means that it's an inherited wealth. I mean, the money which has been passed on to the next generation or which has been inherited money or a bequeathed property. Whereas new money is the money which is earned by the person at the very present times, in the present times. Right. So the protagonist of the novel is James Gads, a man who comes from a modest family. He makes many efforts to rise above poverty. He even changes his name into Jay Gatsby. While in the army, Jay falls in love with Daisy, a beautiful and superficial woman who marries Tom Buchanan. Now, these are some of the characters here. Jay Gatsby, Nick Carraway, Tom Buchanan, Daisy Buchanan, Jordan Baker, Myrtle Wilson, and George Wilson. These are some of the characters we come across in this play, in this novel. Right. Now, the narrator of The Great Gatsby is Nick Carraway, whom he has also casted as the book's author. The chapter begins with Nick commenting on himself, saying that he had learned to reserve judgment about other people from his father because if he holds them to his own moral standards, he would misunderstand them. In the summer of 1922, Nick had just arrived in New York to join in the bond business and he had also rented a house on the West Egg. He also introduces West Egg as home to the new rich and East Egg as the home to the old rich. Nick graduated from Yale and has many connections on East Egg. So one night he drives out to East Egg to have dinner with his cousin Daisy Buchanan and her husband Tom Buchanan. Upon arriving, Tom greets Nick on the porch. Inside, Daisy lies on a couch with her friend Jordan, who is a competitive golf player. Tom tries to interest the others in a book called The Rise of the Colored Empires, which expresses racism. Tom was interrupted with an incoming phone call from his lover from New York. Daisy hurriedly follows him. After an awkward dinner, Jordan goes to sleep, and Tom and Daisy hint that they would like for Nick to take a romantic interest in Jordan. When Nick arrives at his home in West Egg, he sees Gatsby, whom he did not know who he was yet, stretching his arms towards the green light at the end of a dock. Now, Nick Carraway, he is actually the narrator of the book. Nick is a young man from Minnesota who, after being educated at Yale and fighting in World War I, goes to New York City to learn the bond business. Honest, tolerant, and inclined to reserve judgment, Nick often serves as a confidant for those who with troubling secrets. After moving to West Egg, a fictional area of Long Island that is home to the newly rich, Nick quickly befriends his next door neighbor, the mysterious Jay Gatsby. The Great Gatsby is told entirely through Nick's eyes. His thoughts and perceptions shape and color the story. And this is the characters. Now, the themes, what you come across here are violence. That's a key theme in The Great Gatsby and is mostly embodied by the character of Tom. As an ex football player, he uses his immense physical strength to intimidate those around him. Tom Buchanan vulgarly exploits his status. He is grotesque, completely lacking redeeming features. Daisy describes him as a big, hulking physical specimen, and it is seen that he mainly uses his size to intimidate and dominate others. Another theme which you come across here is the class. The society of East and West Egg are deeply divided by the difference between the people who have new money and the people who have old money. Gatsby is new money, which means he only recently began to earn his large sums of money. He tries desperately to fake status, even buying British shirts and claiming to have attended Oxford in an attempt to seem as if he's part of old money. Ultimately, it is class that separates Gatsby and Daisy, which cements Daisy's relationship with her husband, Tom, who is from the same class as she is. The setting, if you look at it, the novel is set in New York in the 1920s at Nick Carraway's bungalow and Gatsby's mansion on West Egg at the Buchanan's mansion on East Egg in various places in New York City, including Myrtle's apartment, the Plaza Hotel, and a restaurant across from the Metropole and in the Valley of Ashes. So we also come across a few more themes here, the American dream theme. Whereas the American dream is one of the major themes in The Great Gatsby. The life of Jay Gatsby himself is an embodiment of the American dream, as he's a poor farm boy who changes his name and reinvents himself to become wealthy and successful, at least financially. Then there's again another element or the theme, that is the dissatisfaction is again one more theme which is quite evident in this novel. Even after achieving a version of the American dream and living the style to which he aspired, Jay Gatsby remained dissatisfied with his success. Despite all he has done, Jay desperately wants what he can't have. So he reaches one milestone or goal only to find that there is always another level, to a point where further advancement is elusive or impossible. And then we also have love and marriage as another theme. In The Great Gatsby, we see how love and marriage are intertwined with society and class as well as dissatisfaction. Jake Gatsby will never win the love of his life, the upper crust, Daisy Buchanan, away from her husband Tom. Earlier in life, Daisy and Jay had dated. But when it was time to marry, she chose someone from her own social class. It may be that Jay really only wants Daisy because she's out of reach and represents what he cannot have, both in terms of love and social status. So, here, if you look at it, marriage is not portrayed in a positive way. Right. So, let us move on to the next novel, that is The Color Purple, which is written by Alice Walker. So, born in Eatonton, Georgia, parents were poor sharecroppers. And during one of the mishap and an accident, left her blind in one eye. And that has also left her to live a life of seclusion. She started writing poetry at the age of 8, coined the phrase womanist for women of color, first Black woman to win Pulitzer Prize for the color purple. She is a self declared feminist and womanist, the latter a term she herself coined to make special distinction for the experiences of women of color. She has written at length on issues of race and gender and is most famous for the critically acclaimed novel The Color Purple, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. So these are some of the quotations, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. In search of my mother's garden, I found my own. Ignorance, arrogance, and racism have bloomed as superior knowledge in all too many universities. So these are some of the quotes. Right. So the color purple, it's actually an epistolary novel. I hope you all remember what was the epistolary. It's like, a novel which is told in or which is written in the form of a letter. So this is actually a letter form, and hence it is called an epistolary novel, in which Alice Walker traces the gradual liberation of Sally, a poor Black woman who must overcome abuse and separation from her beloved sister Nettie. So, this is actually set in the South and an unnamed African country during the 1930s to 1940s. The novel is a study in the ways in which Black women use their faith, relationships, and creativity to survive racial and sexual oppression. The novel was critically acclaimed, garnering Walker the 1983 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and the National Book Award for Fiction. This guide is based on the 1982 Penguin print edition. Okay, let us quickly look into the summary of the plot. So the story is, the title, as we all know, it's The Color Purple. It's a story which is told through a series of diary entries and letters. Sally is a poor and uneducated young woman who at 14 is raped and impregnated twice by a man she believes to be her father. He sold her both of her children to a pastor and his wife, and later sold Sally to a man who originally wanted to marry her sister. After some time of her living there, she's joined in her new home by her younger sister Nettie, whom Sally's new husband had originally wanted to marry. After Sally's husband tries to seduce Nettie and fails, he forces her to leave and she goes to the home of a pastor, promising to write to Sally. As time passes, no such letters appear to arrive, and so Sally assumes that Nettie is dead. Right. Sally's household is thrown into upheaval when Albert brings an ailing Shug home for Sally to nurse to health. Sally manages to heal Shug with good food and leisure, and the two women strike up an unlikely friendship that puzzles and scandalizes their family and acquaintances. Several years later, Harpo marries a bold young woman named Sophia. Now, their marriage ends with Harpo tries to abuse Sophia, and Harpo reinvents himself as a Jew joint owner and partner to another woman, Mary Agnes. When the white mayor and his wife suggest Sophia work for them as their maid, Sophia curses at them and slaps the mayor. She's imprisoned and, in a tragic turn, does later become their domestic worker. Now, Sally stands by as Shug heals and resumes her affairs with Albert. Now, Sally learns to love Shug, who teaches Sally about her own pleasure and uncovers that Albert has been intercepting and hiding letters from Nettie for years. Now, Sally reads years and years of letters from her sister. In her letters, Nettie recounts how the village of the Olinka was destroyed when an English rubber company took over the land. Corin becomes ill and, suspecting that Samuel and Nettie are having an affair, rejects the children because she assumes Nettie is their mother. Corin finally dies knowing this truth. Samuel and Nettie marry, and their mission among the Olinka winds down as the Olinka die out. Adam marries an Olinka girl, and the family head back to America. Now, Sally's life changes dramatically over the years as well. She lives with Shug in Memphis for a long time after Albert's betrayal in hiding the letters becomes too much to bear. She starts her own company and becomes Shug's lover and companion. Shug goes on the road again and is not home so much. But Sally thrives as she asserts control over her life. She returns to Georgia for visits and watches as Albert mellows out and becomes something like a friend to her. Sally discovers in one of the letters from Nettie that Alfonso is not actually her biological father. Nettie discovers the truth from Samuel, who tells the story of how he came to have the children. When Alfonso dies, Sally and Nettie inherit a store, a fine house, and land. Sally experiences heartbreak, however, when Shug leaves Sally for a younger man. Sally also receives word that the ship carrying Nettie and the children sank after hitting a German landmine. This news turns out to be false. However, since Sally still receives letters from her sister, Shug eventually turns up, ready to take up life with Sally again. Nettie, Olivia, and Adam at last make it to Georgia. The family reunites, and Sally is content. Now, what are the themes we come across in this novel? God and spirituality. So, the first words written by Sally, the novel's protagonist, are Dear God. And the novel ends with a letter, the salutation of which reads, Dear God, dear stars, dear trees, dear sky, dear peoples. So, dear everything, dear God. So, this encapsulates the color purple's relationship to religion and spirituality. Right. Another theme is race and racism. The novel takes place in two distinct settings. One is the rural Georgia and a remote African village, both suffused with problems of race and racism. So Sally believes herself to be ugly in part because of her very dark skin. Then we also have men, women, and gender roles. So the novel is also an extended meditation on the nature of men, women, and their expected gender roles. So in the beginning, Sally is expected to serve her abusive father, and later her husband, Mr. Then and Nettie, not wanting to do either, runs away. Then the color purple, where we have violence and suffering, which are actually typically depicted as part of a greater cycle of tragedy taking place both on the family level and on a broader social scale. So it's like this, and so Sally is raped by her stepfather and beaten for many years by her husband, only to have Shuk, a very intervene on her behalf. Sophia is nearly beaten to death by white police officers after pushing a white family. She nearly dies in prison. So violence and suffering is also one of the key theme of this color purple. Then comes the self-discovery. The novel is ultimately a journey of self-discovery for Sally and for other characters too. So she, after meeting Shug and seeing her sister run away, and she tries to realize and she develops practical skills. She is a hard worker in the field. She learns how to manage a house and so on. So the theme of Alice Walker's The Color Purple is very straightforward and simple, like many other novels, devoted to the mistreatment of blacks and black women, especially. The Color Purple is dedicated to black women's rights. Now, this book deals with explicit subject matter and is one of the most often challenged books currently taught in public schools across the US. So this book, in fact, has been challenged for its frank depiction of sexuality and sexual violence, including rape, incest, homosexuality, racism, foul language, and violence. The book has won a Pulitzer Prize and is widely acclaimed to be one of the most important works of American fiction. But in fact, this though it has won the Pulitzer Prize, it was in fact challenged as inappropriate reading material for students. So, in the decades since Walker has addressed censorship in speeches, essays, and book, Alice Walker banned. It was banned. So, characters, if you look at Nettie, it's her Nettie's life is based on Walker's own personal trip to Africa. Nettie is a high culture heroine, the most that can be expected from someone raised in a culture of violence and misogyny. Now, sisterhood is also again another main theme of this novel and how it can be achieved and at what cost. So, by the end of this novel, most of these women have come to terms of acceptance of the others' women's way of being, which suggests a possible unification despite sexual morality is possible among women. Well, in addition to her vernacular, one thing that distinguishes Sally's letters is the model of spoken language. Shelley tells stories by faithfully recording the dialogues between the characters. This creates vivid characterization. So here, Alice Walker describing herself as a womanist, a black feminist or feminist of color, strives to explore the oppressions, the insanities, the loyalties, and the triumphs of black women and to sustain their creativity. Severe attacks have been launched against the novel because of its pernicious characterizations of black men. But Walker claimed that she based the characterizations on her two grandfathers, who were really horrible people, very misogynous, very mean, but who became mild when they got old. Her major works include The Third Life of Grange Copeland, In Love and Trouble, stories of Black women and revolutionary petunias and other poems, Meridian, The Color Purple, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. They are actually the collection of essays. Horses Make a Landscape Look More Beautiful, Temple of My Familiar, Possessing the Secret of Joy, By the Light of My Father's Smile. Now is the time to open your heart. So these are some of the major themes in most of her writings we come across. That is poverty and how hope rises from it, family, love, sexuality, violence, racism, and slavery, sexism. Right. So with this, we come to an end of the session. As said earlier, I want you all to go through the last module, that is the final module tomorrow, which I'll be taking it up. And so basically, this is how you're going to read the material. That is the intro at the beginning of it with all the details, the features, the characteristics, and the writers of that particular age. And then what are its significant features? That is, why does it stand out? What are the things which makes it stand out from the rest of the ages, right? All these things. Then we have two novels per module. So this time it is Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Alice Walker, The Color Purple. So what are you basically going to focus on? One is you should be reading the biography of the writer, then the plot, then the analysis, right? For every novel, you will have a sort of analysis, the summary of it, and then the characterization. That is very, very important in this reading of a novel. So then the characterization, that is who are the characters and what is their role, and each one's role, how does it go with the plot, the storyline, right? And which are the major characters, which are the minor characters, and then you also should know to analyze the novel. That is like the theme, the setting, and basically the themes, in fact. Okay, and the perspective, what kind of a perspective you get to know after you read this novel. So these are some of the things you have to read it in a novel, right? Along with the biography of the writer, these are the points you have to look into: the plot, the summary, the analysis, themes, characterization, right? So, and with this, we finish the session. See you tomorrow at the same time. Thank you.